Good day, everyone. So for this session, Group 4 will be discussing defense in depth and contingency plan. So we are to cover four main topics in this session. The first part would be on defense in depth, and then incident response plan to be followed with contingency plan and business continuity plan. All right. To start with, um, let's discuss what defense in depth first is. Okay, defense in depth is basically a series of defensive mechanisms layered in order to protect valuable data and information. This is actually an approach wherein if one mechanism fails, another steps out immediately to mitigate or thwart an attack. This multi-layered approach with intentional redundancies because of its repetitive layers before it reaches the application of the web server is intentional because the redundancy increases the security of a system as a whole, and it addresses many different attacks from incoming vectors. Okay. In addition to this, defense in depth is commonly referred as castle approach because it mirrors the layered defense from a medieval castle. Because as you all know, before you can penetrate a castle, you are faced with moats, ramparts, drawbridge, towers, battlements, and until you draw swords with soldiers. All right, so defense in depth has three main key enablers, which are the people, technology, and operations. And hopefully we will cover this all as we move forward. So in defense in depth, there are actually three main layers that help us to protect our data or the software itself. First would be the physical control. So physical control actually refers to the IT measures that we use to prevent any physical access to IT systems such as security guards and locked doors. These are our initial protections in our facilities. Okay, followed with technical controls. So network systems or resources that specialize hardware or software, such as firewall appliances or antivirus, is being protected by these technical controls. So I'll be giving examples in a while on where these technical and physical controls vary. And above all, administrative controls is the measure that we use in determining the policies or procedures directed to specific employees within the organization. So if you remember, this is wherein confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility falls on. All right. So let's take a look at an example coming from Certified Information Systems and Security Professional. So this is known as CISSP. So if I am a user, I will actually have to conduct a web traffic before I could access the application. And this has to go through all these devices. So I would have to connect to the internet, of course, and then in order for me to conduct any transaction within that application, I would have to go to this unseen layer of protection provided by the organization that I'm trying to access. So the routers here, internal facing router, firewall with intrusion and detection system with another internal router, and load balancer are actually, in a sense, defense in depth. This is in a network perspective. Okay, let's take a look at this in this illustration. So you can see here that in the initial layer, we have the internet facing router. So the internet facing router has the closest layer to any internet or malicious attack coming from the user. So this actually takes it all at the first stage, followed with the firewall. So the firewall here has both an intrusion, prevention, and detection system that helps us to mitigate further issues if there are. Then another set of internal router that checks on the IPs and the credential of the users. Then the load balancer. So the load balancer here is actually the last layer for the user to access the application. So this is very crucial because the client device sits just beside or in between the backend server. So when the user reaches this, pretty much the next step is accessing the web application or the source code itself and conduct the traffic. Now, you might think na why not put the security in the source code itself or in the application itself instead of coming up with these layers? So in the industry, basically, especially in software development, there's this what we call the minimum viable product or MVP. Product owners or business people would like their product and software running immediately in the market and start generating revenues. So if you have to develop all of the security measures within the application or within the software or integrating it within the source code, it would take longer than the forecast timeline. And of course, it will also slow down the pace of continuous integration and continuous development for these organizations. So that would be the drawback of that. Technical controls here refers to the routers, load balancers, and firewalls that are actually being used. So this might be tangible, but this does not necessarily refer to physical controls. So these are controls that falls on technical controls, and this meant to stop technical attacks such as sync floods, denial services, or email containing malicious attacks. All right. So moving forward, so in the textbook that we use in the preparation for this presentation, coming from the Information Security Essentials for IT Managers, authored by Albert Caballero, so he has made a mind map here that focuses not only on the network perspective I have just presented, but also on the defense in depth in terms of the technology that you use, the architecture, of course, the people or the procedures and policies that you have, operations as well, and even to the risk management. So given the time that we have, I will be leaving this for your own reading, but essentially defense in depth contains the multi-layered defensive mechanism in order to protect valuable information and data coming from any malicious attack. Okay, so let's proceed with incident response plan. So what happens if your defense in depth fails? So there is one element that makes all of the defense in depth mechanisms fail, which is the human interaction. So essentially, the weakness of defense in depth is social engineering. What is this? So social engineering happens when a human element, not a packet coming from form of IPv4 package or IPv6 packet, or some things that has to do with the source code, but instead it has something to do with credentials that they do not specifically own, but they do have access with. So instead of hacking the router, bypassing the firewall, manipulating the load balancer, and finally reaching the source code, they would just have to go through with the usual process of knowing the credential and accessing valuable data which are not intended for them. Okay. So what do we do with that? Of course, we have to counter it with an incident response plan, which is essentially to anticipate, detect, and mitigate further impact if this happens. So it has actually 6 major phases, which are the preparation, identification, containment, eradication, recovery, and of course, lastly, the lesson learned or the postmortem. So let's run through all of this incident life cycle. So in this incident response plan, we are actually engaged from the planning. So in this planning, we must ensure that employees are properly trained, develop incident response drill scenarios, and regularly conduct mock data breaches to evaluate further incident response plan. The question in this first step is, has everyone been trained on security policies? Have your security policies and incident response plan been approved by the appropriate management? Have all incident response team members anticipate and participated the mock drills? So that's for the planning and preparation. Followed with identification. So in identifying, well, we need to set events that have some negative impact on business and can be considered a security incident. So this process is wherein we determine if we've been already breached, and a breach or incident could originate from many areas. So the questions here is, where did it happen? How was it discovered? Who discovered it? Have any other areas were impacted? Okay, so and above all, does it affect the operation? Then to be followed with, of course, containment. So we already know here that the bridge has been done. So what we need to do here is to mitigate its potential damage. In this phase, this is where we update the patch of the system, review remote access protocols such as the multi-factor authentication. So in some organizations such as Google or AWS, even in local companies like Globe or Smart, they have factor authentication such as AWS Console or even Okta that generate codes that only those who have it can access the application. So it's about time if you need to change that or check the credibility of the users who are actually engaged. You can change all the user and administrative access and credentials to harden all passwords. All right, so in these questions or in this phase, you have to answer the questions that mainly focus on what has been done to contain the breach in short term, what has been done to contain the breach in the long term, and of course, has the malware been discovered and has it been quarantined already? Okay, so have all the updates. To give you a quick example of what we've discussed before is the Equifax. So Equifax is one of the good example here, because if you remember, Equifax is a credit reporting agencies in the United States that had an actual data breach way back in September 2017, and 147 million of American citizens' personal data were actually exposed online. So the problem there is that the needed patch that has to be updated were not done by their resources. So unfortunately, that resulted to data breach of personal information and data. Okay, next would be eradication. So this means that all malware should be securely removed. System should gain system should again be hardened and patched, and update should be applied. So the question here is, have artifacts and malware from attackers been securely removed? Has the system been patched and updated? And can the system be re-imaged? So this is more of, when the containment happened, you thoroughly eradicate the malware. Okay, so whether you do it yourself or hire a third party to do it, you need to be thorough. Or if any trace of malware or security issues remain in your system, you may still be losing valuable data and your liability could increase. So a thorough eradication is needed here. Then, of course, the recovery stage. This is the process of restoring and returning affected systems and devices back into your business. So this is essentially bringing the business back to normal and then involving assets in the security incident back to normal operations. So the question that needs to be answered in this response is, when can systems be returned to production? Have systems been again patched, hardened, and tested? This is the third time we're actually saying this, because we are still in the process of removing, cleaning, and hardening our system. So how long will the affected systems be monitored? This is usually known as the stub period, wherein we look into how long should we look forward in monitoring still possible issues that could be raised? How long will affected systems um, will ensure effectiveness in the operations is also another question to be answered here. And lastly, of course, the lessons learned or the postmortem. So a thorough review of how the incident happened and the actions taken to respond it, where the lessons learned are taken. So in this phase, once the investigation is complete, the team is encouraged to hold an after action meeting with an all incident response team. So in software development, in every sprint or 2 week to 4 week duration of development, there's this what they call sprint retrospective, wherein they talk about what went well, what went wrong, and needs to improve items. Similarly, in the incident response life cycle, we need to talk about those kind of things. So questions that answers what changes need to be made to the security, how should employees be trained differently, and what weakness did the breach exploit?
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Zara Melgar from Group 4. Any good manager always has a plan B. If plan A fails, plan B is activated decisively. The goal is to smoothly transition to plan B without failing a project or the business, thus minimizing downtime or discontinuity. Disruption or disaster can happen anytime. It can be an earthquake or a pandemic. A war can break out. Whether natural or man-made, any disaster is bound to cause an unprepared organization for business stoppage and consequently losses. This is where contingency planning comes in. However, contingency planning isn't just about major crises or natural disasters. It can also prepare an organization for more commonplace problems such as loss of data, staff, customers, or even business relationships. Thus, it's important to make contingency planning a routine part of the way we work. Specifically on the topic of managing information security, any reputable organization that recognizes its exposure to any form of operational risk has contingency plans in place. At the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, organizations across Europe were left dangerously exposed to increased cybercriminal activity, with 50% of cybersecurity professionals saying that their organization either had no contingency plans for such an event in place or they did not know if they did. This lack of planning appears to have come at a great risk, with 86% saying they had seen a pronounced upswing in threat activity, especially with the astronomical shift to remote working conditions. Put simply, a contingency plan is the overall preparation for unexpected events. A contingency plan is often used in risk management for an exceptional risk that, though unlikely, may cause catastrophic consequences. It aims to prepare an organization to respond well to an emergency and its potential impact. It is necessary in several ways for an organization to be sure it can withstand security breaches or disasters. The main purpose of contingency planning is to preserve businesses from disruptions and disasters. Contingency planning is crucial for the success and continuity of any organization. The contingency planning process can basically be broken down into three simple questions. Number one, what is going to happen? Number two, what are we going to do about it? And number three, what can we do ahead to get prepared? Here is a more detailed process that can be taken for contingency planning. First, we identify the mission or business critical functions, and then we identify the resources that support these critical functions. We anticipate potential contingencies or disasters, and we select the contingency planning strategy that is best suited for that certain type of scenario. This selected strategy is then implemented, and the contingency plans are also tested and revised accordingly after several periods of time. There are four types of contingency plans according to the base material that we have. These include business impact analysis or BIA, incident response planning or IRP, disaster recovery planning or DRP, and business continuity planning or BCP. IR planning was already discussed by Sajid earlier, so for this portion, we will only tackle BIA, DRP, and BCP. Let's start with BIA. Business impact analysis identifies mission-critical business processes and drafts clear strategy to recover from an interruption in any of these key areas. A process or a system is identified as mission-critical if it will halt the organizational operations. BIA intends to help an organization to appreciate the magnitude of the operational and financial impacts associated with a disaster or a serious disruption. Then to use this knowledge to calculate the recovery time objective or RTO and the recovery point objective or RPO for time critical support services and resources. For most organizations, these support resources include facilities, IT infrastructure, hardware and software, vital records, data, and even business partners. A very good implementation of BIA is key to a successful implementation of DRP and BCP. In business impact analysis, there are two key terms that is needed to be calculated. Number one is recovery time objective or RTO, which refers to the time it takes for the functional restoration of a business process, which means it is close to where it was before the disruption. Meanwhile, the other one, RPO or recovery point objective, is a data loss metric expressed in time directly related to applications. While RTO and RPO are related, in many cases, they aren't the same. For example, we have here some scenarios that illustrate different RTOs and RPOs. For high RTO, low RPO, we have the accounts payable process. The accounts payable process typically has a long recovery time because in a disruption, paying out isn't considered a highly critical business activity. So accounts payable must have an RTO of approximately 5 days. That means your recovery strategy will aim to have the accounts payable process and all of its required applications up and running in 5 days. However, the computer system itself has valuable data on it, and any loss of that data will result in the team no longer having a way to tell what checks have been previously cut or what invoices have been submitted recently. In this situation, there's little to no room for data loss, so the RPO is near zero. The opposite is true in maintaining a web presence. In the event of a disruption, restoring the company website is a high priority, so the RTO is almost immediate. However, the data on the site probably may not change very often, probably once a week, once a month, so it's less critical to guard against data loss, resulting in a higher RPO. However, for massive online retailers like Amazon, Lazada, Shopee, its website must always be operational or near zero RTO, and its data loss must be also non-existent or near zero RPO. So without a quick recovery of the website and all its associated data, the impact of a disruption would be catastrophic. In this case, there is a similar RTO and RPO. In the business impact analysis process, your inputs would be the criticality and sensitivity of assets, as well as the resource classification. After the business impact analysis, the outputs would be the strategy for business continuity and recovery, criticality prioritization, the RTO, and the RPO. Let's move on to DRP. DRP, or Disaster Recovery Planning, is the preparation and recovery from a disaster with focus on re-establishing operations at the primary site. An incident becomes a disaster because an organization is unable to contain its impact or it's not able to recover quickly due to the severe impact of that disaster or disruption. An effective DRP is critical in reducing recovery time and the cost of downtime. If an organization does not have an effective disaster recovery plan, when a failure occurs, the organization will be faced with extended downtime and exponentially rising costs due to confusion and lack of documented processes. This organization is gambling on being able to define and implement a recovery strategy during a time of crisis. At the very least, this means extended downtime, potentially weeks or even months, and substantial business impact. So DRP is very important. The key activities in DRP include identifying critical applications and dependencies, defining a desired recovery timeline based on BIA, and creating a step-by-step incident response plan. Now let's move on to BCP, or Business Continuity Planning. Business continuity planning ensures critical business functions can continue during a disaster. BCP is so important that it is managed by the CEO or GM of an organization. It identifies the resources needed to support the critical business functions with exclusive use options or shared use options. It is important that BCP is activated concurrently with DRP to focus on re-establishing operations at alternate sites. Exclusive use options can be a hot site, a cold site, or a warm site. A hot site is essentially a mirror of the current data center, which can be an immediate replacement for the impacted site. However, it may be a bit costly. On the other hand, a cold site does not have any server-related equipment pre-installed in the alternate site, and this is cost-effective, but it will take some time to get up. Lastly, the midpoint between the two sites is a warm site, which has some pre-installed server hardware, and it's ready for installation of the production environment. The organization is best suited to identify which type of exclusive use option or shared use option is needed for its BCP. The shared use options can be timeshares, service bureaus, mutual agreements, or specialized alternatives as listed on the slide. When an organizational disaster occurs, an organization implements its DRP. The DRP team works to establish operations at the primary business site, and the BCP team moves the operations to an alternate site to minimize downtime. In addition, when an attack occurs, the incident is detected and thus triggers the IRP. If the incident is classified as a disaster, the DRP is activated to restore operations at the primary site. If it damages the primary site and requires off-site operations, BCP is then triggered concurrently with DRP as a continuity reaction, and the alternate site is kept until the primary operations are fully restored. Because DRP and BCP are closely related, most organizations actually prepare them concurrently into one file. It can be done, however, it must be comprehensive. The comprehensive plan must be comprehensive enough with separate execution teams when a disaster happens. It cannot be the same team handling DRP and BCP at the same time, since these are at different sites. Contingency planning activities are interrelated with each other, and for good reason. An organization's response team can change from one to another seamlessly if there is a need. Furthermore, the output of one process is an input to another. For example, BIA identifies time-sensitive or critical business functions, which is then needed information for the other contingency plans that we discussed, especially in BCP and DRP. The learnings from the IRP will trigger an organization's DRP when a disruption becomes a disaster. BCP involves planning for and keeping all aspects of a business functioning in the midst of a disruptive event. Because this largely includes the technical aspects of the business, the organization cannot have business continuity if it does not have disaster recovery in place. Thus, Both business continuity and disaster recovery need to be working in tandem with each other to ensure that the business can thrive in the face of adversity. Finally, contingency plans must be tested and revised as time goes by. Once problems are identified during the testing process, improvements can be made and the resulting plan can be relied on in times of need. There are 5 testing strategies that can be used. Number 1, desk check. It can also be a structured walkthrough, a simulation, parallel testing, or full interruption. That's it for the contingency plan and defense in depth. Thank you everyone for your attention and have a great day.